The first piece of equipment I have to repair for this new year is this awesome vintage Echo blower that belongs to one of my many coworkers at the giant facility I work at. The first time I set my eyes on it, I was immediately enamored by it. Now, I just made a video about Echo equipment and how wonderful they are to own and use. Now I get to see if my statement was true or if I've been wrong all this time. In today's video, we're going to look at this vintage Echo backpack blower, and the problem is that it's been sitting for a very long time and now it won't start. Now, I've already made a video about this blower, and if you want to see that video, there should be a link to it at the top of the screen or at the end of the video. And before I try to fix it, I need to give it a quick cleaning. That way I don't get dirt in places where it shouldn't be, like in the carb, fuel tank, or inside the engine. The other reason I need to clean it is because I need to keep my hands clean since I'm filming it. Now, I don't mind getting my hands or my tools dirty while working, but getting my video equipment dirty is something I try to avoid doing. Now, that may not apply to you, but it's important to me. While I'm cleaning this blower, I'm going to talk about owning and using old equipment and how it's different when you're talking about a reputable brand versus the cheaper stuff. Now, there's nothing wrong with getting and using 30 to 40-year-old cheap brands, but after seeing this beauty, you're going to understand what the difference really is. The first impression I got from this backpack blower was weight. Even though it's no bigger than a small to mid-sized backpack blower, it weighs an incredible 23.5 pounds. Now, by its size, I didn't expect it to be so heavy. The question is, why is it so heavy? The answer is pretty simple: metal. And a lot of it. Now, this blower isn't old enough to have a metal blower housing, but they certainly didn't spare it either. After taking a look around, I soon realized just how much metal was on this machine as compared to something more modern. The recoil assembly is twice the size of a current one, the muffler is almost as big as the engine, and it also has a metal heat shield around it. On top of that, the fuel tank is held to the metal frame with, you guessed it, a metal bracket. The only words I have for this blower besides heavy is sturdy, but is all this metal really necessary? The answer to the question is yes, and the reason is durability. Guess what this blower is designed for? Working, which means there's a good chance it's going to be thrown around and probably even abused while being handled and transported. Now, I'm not saying it's designed to fall off the back of a moving truck on the highway, but it is going to take being bumped around a lot better than if 95% of it was made out of plastic. One of the best design features of this entire blower is the intake system. I've always seen this style before, but I've never had a chance to work on one until now, and now that I've seen it up close, it's even better than I could have imagined it to be. The reason this style is so good is because it allows the use of a large air filter instead of a small pleated one. That means there's plenty of air getting into the engine so it can do some serious work. Of course, one of the things I like to check for is whether the engine will even start and run. Otherwise, there's really no point in working on it or even cleaning it, to be honest. Now, if you still want to clean it so you can hang it on your wall, I guess that would be reason enough to clean it up some. Hopefully, we don't get disappointed during our first test start. So unfortunately, the engine didn't start, which is not a good sign. Now, recently I was informed that Echo equipment has an issue with bad ignition coils, which I'd never heard of before. So the next step I want to take is to make sure we have spark at the plug. You don't need any special tools for this test. All you need to do is connect the wire back to the plug, rest the plug against the metal, and slowly pull on the rope. So it was a bit difficult to see with the amount of sunlight, and it was a bit inconsistent, but that's more than likely because of intermittent contact with the metal. However, I did see some sparks at the tip of the plug, so we know we have a working ignition system. Now, just to make sure there isn't an issue with getting fuel into the throat of the carb, I'm going to put fuel into the engine through the spark plug opening instead. Now, I don't typically have to do it this way, but sometimes if there's a metal plate in front of the carb's throat like this one, doing it this way will solve that issue. Luckily, the engine started and ran at idle speed for several seconds, which is great news. Now, if it didn't start, I would have to check the engine compression using a tester, which I did use for the repair video. Of course, since it started and ran, it means the engine must have a decent amount of compression, and considering how old this engine is, it means my coworker made sure to use the correct fuel mixture, otherwise it wouldn't have lasted this long. Now that I know that repairing this vintage blower is more than likely going to have a favorable outcome, I'm going to put the intake back onto the carb and start cleaning it. So what if the engine didn't start? What would I have done? Well, the first thing would be to do some more diagnostic work to try and pinpoint what exactly is causing the blower not to start. Once I figure that out, I would then call and let my coworker know what's going on and then let them decide how to proceed. If they didn't know what to do, I would gladly make my own recommendations, and some of them they may not like. So this is when we start to see the differences when working on good vintage equipment versus the cheaper stuff from decades ago. The biggest difference is a perceived difference in value. So what do I mean by that? Simply put, you can still get parts for this blower. Now, if this had been a Homelite blower from the same period, the likelihood of getting OEM parts or even aftermarket parts is very unlikely. But since Echo equipment is perceived to be good quality, parts for them are still made. Now, is that unfair? Let's pretend it's 25 years ago and you have a budget of only $100 to get a backpack blower. That means an Echo blower was not a possibility, but the Homelite backpack blower fits into your budget, so you bought it instead. Fast forward a decade later and you need parts for your Homelite, but you have some difficulties finding them, and when you do find them, they cost a pretty penny. Now, fortunately, you were taught how to take care of your stuff, so another decade goes by and you finally need another part. Now, this time, however, you don't get so lucky and you can't find the parts you need. In fact, it's so bad, you can't even find the parts you were able to get the last time. That means as time goes by, there's a good chance you may not be able to find any parts you need to keep your cheap blower going. So what are you supposed to do when you can no longer find the parts you need to keep your machine going? Simply put, you're going to need to get creative. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you needed a carb kit or even the entire carb for your machine, you might have to do some research or even some trial and error and find one from a different machine that you might be able to get to work on your machine. But are you willing to spend the time and, more importantly, the money on a labor-intensive effort? I'll be quite honest, even if I had the time or money, that doesn't sound like something I want to do or even bother with. If you don't want to get creative, then what should you do when trying to find parts for your machine? Unfortunately, there's only one thing left to do, which is to try and find a second machine to use for parts, and hopefully its parts still work, but I hate to tell you what the chances are for that to happen. At some point, you're going to have to realize that you're stuck in a very bad situation, and the only choice is to either buy a new machine and hope you don't fall into the same situation again. But what do I mean by that? Well, you got in this situation by purchasing the cheaper tool and trying to be the best owner you could be. You cared for it to try and make it last for as long as it could, but there's a problem with what you're doing. The issue is they don't want you to do that. The makers of the cheaper stuff want you to buy it, use it, and then break it, and then buy another new one, and that's it. But you trying to make it last longer than it should is your way of sticking it to those companies. However, those companies are going to win because they know that if they keep the prices low enough, that the aftermarket is not going to support it, and that means you won't be able to stick it to them for very long, and you'll have to cave in at some point. Years ago, gasoline prices would increase to a high price on some random day of the week, and in retaliation, we were told, do not put gasoline in your cars for a day or two. But that never really worked because you would eventually need to fill up at some point. You were only delaying the inevitable. However, if you had decided to instead sell your car and got a bicycle instead, that would have made a much better impression. But you know that wasn't going to happen, and so does the rest of big business. In the end, you're going to lose, and in our case, that's going to happen here. Or is it? Now, there is one way to get around this whole situation, but you might not like it. The solution would be to not buy another cheap machine to replace the one you can't find parts for, but instead buy a much better brand that you know the aftermarket is going to support for the long term. So instead of buying the cheapest gasoline handheld blower you can afford, but instead pay 25 to 35% more for a name brand blower. Now, this will ensure that you'll have a better chance of keeping that blower working for a lot longer. I think I'd rather pay a little bit more now than pay for a brand new machine later on, but to each their own. I do want to bring one small issue up though, is that money doesn't grow on trees, so a price difference of $50 to $100 could mean a lot to some consumers who are on a tight budget. So for me, I see buying cheap equipment and using them for as long as humanly possible as a challenge and well worth it. It's sort of like when you buy an emergency cell phone power pack that's only meant to be used once and then recycled, but instead you take it apart, modify it so you can charge it and then use it over and over again. Now, should you do that? Probably not, but it's been done before. So what I'm recommending is that if you don't want to spend more money than you need to buy equipment, buy what you can afford and then take care of it the best you can, and it's not all that difficult to do. If you need to mix oil and gasoline for your machine, find a way to mix it as easily as possible and as consistently as possible, and at the end of the season, run the fuel out of the machine, and if for some reason you start to have some issues, look up some videos to help solve them. Now, I'm not going to make any guarantees, but taking these few steps will help to make sure your machine will last longer than those big companies think they will, and you'll be better off in the long run. If you don't think you can do that, then buying a quality machine is not going to fix the situation. I do believe quality machines are better made and can take some abuse, but they are not immune to heavy abuse. And just like the cheaper machines, they will eventually start to have issues. That means you need to take decent care of your machines, expensive or not. And if you take care of them and they last several years and you start to have some issues, you shouldn't feel any shame in buying a new machine to replace the last one. So whose fault is it when your machine, expensive or not, starts to have issues when it's only 1 or 2 seasons old? Now this one is a tricky question, and I hate to point fingers, but if that question was asked by someone who gave me their machine to work on, I'd have a list of questions ready for them to answer, and then you might see who's really at fault. Those questions would be, what kind of fuel do you use? Is it from a gas station, or is it canned fuel? Do you leave fuel in your machine when not using it? Do you run the machine out of fuel at the end of the season? Do you use the machine at full speed most of the time, or are you using it at part throttle? Now, if you haven't figured out, most of the questions are related to the fuel they put into the machine, and then the questions relate to how they're using their machines. Now, these questions are all pointing to user error. Now, am I being mean, or do I have a good point? Now, the machines are not going to just fail by sitting there unused in their boxes. If that was the case, they would fail while in their boxes in a warehouse or on the ships that bring them over. They typically start to have issues once the consumers get them in their hands. Most will not understand that how they treat or use their machines will eventually be the reason they fail. In the future, there's really nothing you can do about it. It's just how it goes, but you can keep it from happening sooner than later. Now, unless you want to start using hand tools from the 1800s, you're going to need to use these tools, so I would try to figure out how to make them last. And if you're already doing that, I applaud you. You're doing exactly what the companies don't want you to do, which is to make that machine last longer than they want them to, which keeps them from getting wealthier because you're able to keep their products from failing. So is it worth buying the more expensive equipment? Not if you're not going to take care of them. So buy what you can afford, and if you buy a good quality machine, good for you. But if you can only afford the cheaper ones, there's nothing wrong with that. Just remember to read the owner's manual and put good fuel in the machine, and you shouldn't have too many issues. So my question is, if it was in your budget, would you buy the more expensive equipment, or would you save the money and buy the cheaper stuff because you know how to take care of them to make them last? There isn't a right or wrong answer to this one, but there is a wrong way to taking care of your stuff. Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions about this project or about your own projects, and I hope to see you in the next video.